Hey everyone, welcome to Data Millennials. I'm Atul, and in this video we are going to see how we can create and customize pivot table with heat map in our Looker dashboard. You have most often heard and mostly used pivot tables in Excel, but Looker provides you the functionality to create and customize the pivot table to narrow down a large data set or analyze relationship between different data points. Pivot table reorganize your dimensions and matrices to help you quickly summarize your data and see relationship that might otherwise be hard to spot. So we will be creating this pivot table which you see on your screen from scratch. But before we go ahead and start creating this pivot table, let's first discuss what exactly a pivot table is and how it can be used in your dashboard. A pivot table is a statistical tool that summarizes and reorganizes selected columns and rows of data in the Looker table to obtain a desired report. For example, if you see this raw data over here, then you will see that we have country code, number of items sold, date, and revenue. Seeing this raw data will not give you any kind of inference or any kind of information that whether is there any relationship exist between the country with the date, with the number of items sold, and revenue. So what we are trying to do is that we are just trying to find a relationship between the number of items sold and revenue. And by seeing this raw data, you won't be able to figure it out. And that's where this pivot table comes handy, that it will help you to analyze your data and figure out the relationship between them. So this pivot table does not actually change the raw data itself. It simply pivots or turns the data to view it from different perspective. Pivot tables are specifically useful with large amount of data that would be time consuming to calculate manually or by hand. A few data processing functions a pivot table can perform, including identifying the sums, average, ranges, or outliers. The table then arranges this information in a simple, meaningful layout that draws attention to the key values. Now, the question that should come to your mind is that how pivot table works and how can we create it? So pivot table in Looker takes the rows in a standard format or a standard table and pivot them so that they becomes column. As you can see over here, this India and Bahrain is in column, while in our raw data it is in row values. This lets you group and summarize the data in ways a standard table cannot provide. So when you create a pivot table, there are four main components. The first component is column. So when a field is chosen for the column area, only the unique values of the fields are listed across the top. For example, as you can see over here, we have India and Bahrain, and as matter of fact, we can see that we have 45 count over here. So this means including header, we have 45, right? So we have 44 record of these country, where 22 is India and 22 record pertains to Bahrain. But you can see over here, we have India and Bahrain twice only. So when you choose a field, it will only choose the unique value and show it across the top. Now, the second main component is row. When a field is chosen for row area, it populates as the first column. As you can see over here, date as the first column. Similar to the columns, all row labels are the unique values and duplicates are removed over here. You won't be able to find any duplicate over here. For example, 14th January will not be repeating in first column. Now the third main component is values. Each value is kept in a pivot table cell and displays the summarized information. So this 112 is a summarized information. The most common values are sum, average, minimum, and maximum that we use in day-to-day life. The last and the fourth main component of pivot table is filters. So filters apply a calculation or restriction to the entire table. So suppose if you want to filter out some of the data, then you can use a filtration so that that data will not appear on your pivot table. So this pivot table is a standard table listing the day-on-day sales quantity and revenues in millions by calendar, date, and by country. While this table is useful for showing which country has the most revenue and high quality of sale or high quantity of sale, it is useful for summarizing the data in a meaningful way. A pivot table, however, quickly shows the relationship of this data. This table easily summarizes the data for you, and you can quickly spot outliers or anomalies in your data. Pivot table in Looker supports adding multiple rows and column dimension, which further breaks down the data and giving you even more insight about your data. So let's go and create a pivot table just like this that you see on your screen from scratch as an example. So what I'm going to do over here is that I'm going to click on this edit button so that I can get into edit mode, and I'll add a page so that on that second page I can show you how you can create this pivot table with heat map from scratch. So I'll copy this header and put it over here. Now the first thing which is required to create a pivot table with heat map is your data source. If you have already loaded your data source onto Looker, then you can go ahead and start creating pivot table. If you have not done that, then you can click on resources, then you have to click on manage added data sources. Then you will get an option to add a data source over here. You can click on it and it will take you to Google connectors, where you can select any of your connector and then you can add your data. Once you have added your data, then you need to click on add a chart and you have to go down. You have to select this third option, pivot table with heat map, under this pivot table. When you select this, then Looker will allow you to add a pivot table with heat map, and you will see once the data will start appearing over here, as it has started appearing data over here, then you will see that Looker has already selected some of the row dimensions, column dimensions, matrices for you just to get you started. Now what we are going to do over here is that we are going to find out relationship between number of items sold and revenue, and we are going to replicate this pivot table on our page 2. But while replicating that, we will be discussing about the setup section as well as the style section, and we will be discussing about each and every option that is present over here. As you can see, it's quite huge or quite large number of options that is presented over here, so we will be discussing each and everything in detail. So what exactly is this setup section? So this option in a chart setup panel determines how the data is organized and displayed. And within this setup section, the first option that we have over here is data source. A data source provides the connection between the component and the underlying data. So for you, the component is this pivot table with heat map, and the underlying data is this which you have selected over here. Now suppose if you want to change your data for this pivot table, what you can do is that you can click over here and select any of the added data source or available data source from here. But suppose if you want to add a new data source, then you can click over here on add data. Then you will be seeing these data connectors, and you can select any of your data connector based on your requirement, and you can add that data, and then this pivot table which you have created will start showing data from that newly added source. The next option that we have over here is date range dimension. So this option appears if your data source has a valid date range dimension. The date range dimension is used as the basis for limiting the date range for the pivot. For example, if a viewer of the report uses a date range control to limit the time frame, then he will only be able to see the data in the pivot table for the selected date range. And as I have said, this option only appears if your data source has a valid date dimension. For example, in our raw data, we have a column date, which you can see over here, which is an appropriate date column. That's why Looker has specifically or by default added this date column as a date range dimension. Now the next option that we have over here is row dimension. Before we discuss this row dimension, let's discuss what exactly is a dimension. So dimensions are the data categories. The dimension value is the data contained by the dimensions, such as names, description, or other characteristics of the category. So this row dimension provides the breakdown of rows in a pivot table. So as you can see over here that Looker has by default selected this country code ISO 2 in a row dimension, but what we need as a row dimension is the date. So what we can do is that we can remove this and select date as our row dimension. Now if you want to add another dimension over here, you can add it from here. For example, I can add country code ISO 2 as a second row dimension, but we only need date. That's why we'll remove this country code ISO 2. Now within this row dimension, you will see this option expand collapse. If you turn on this expand and collapse, then it will treat the row dimension as an expandable hierarchy. The order in which you list the dimensions over here within the hierarchy matters. As a rule of thumb, you should define hierarchy to always go from most general to most specific. For example, defining a geographic hierarchy must be like this: continent, subcontinent, country, state, city, and district, which could produce a desirable result. For an example, as you can see over here, when I turned on this expand collapse, you will see the hierarchy year. Within year, you will have year and month. This means that within a year, you will have months, and within months, you will have dates. So this is a appropriate hierarchy. So whenever you're turning on this expand and collapse, you have to make sure the hierarchy is maintained for the desirable result. So for us, we do not need this expand or collapse, so we'll turn it off and we'll remove this year and year month. The next option within setup is column dimension. The column dimension provides the column in the pivot table. We can reorder the dimension listed to change the order of the column in our table. So as per our requirement, we need to show country over here in our column dimension. So we'll remove date and we'll select country code ISO 2, and then you will see for each date we are getting 2 countries over here, and in metric we have record count by default. So we are seeing that for each country, for each date, we have 2 records. Now moving on to metric. This metric measures the things contained in dimension and provide the numeric scale and data series for the chart. As you can see over here, this 2 is the record count for each date, and this is the numeric scale for each country on a specific date. So metrics are aggregation that comes from the underlying data set that are a result of implicit or explicitly applying an aggregation function such as count, sum, or average. So you can apply an aggregate function once you select a metric. So for example, if I select over here number of items sold in 1000, then I can use any of the aggregate functions such as sum. From here, sum, average, count, count distinct, minimum, maximum, median, standard deviation, and variance, right? So as per our requirement, we need number of items sold in 1000 and we need revenue in millions. So you can see a difference that in our previous video, when we created pivot table, a simple pivot table, then we do not had this heat map, right? And as we had added matrices over here, you can see that heat map is showing by default. So this is a difference between simple pivot table and a pivot table with heat map. Now within this metric, we have an option of optional metric. With this optional metric, we can define a list of additional matrices that we can display on the table. So for example, if I want to display the number of records and I do not want user to see that number of record first, but if he wants, he can see that based on his requirement. In that situation, I can select this optional metrics and I can select the metric as the record count. Now you won't be able to see this record count on this pivot table at first, but let me go to view, and as a user, when you open this report, you will only see the number of items sold and revenue in millions for each country. But now if you want to see the number of records, then what you can do is that you can click over here. Here is the option of optional metrics. You can click over here and you can select this record count. So by default, this record count will be unselected as it is an optional metric. But if you select this, then you will be able to see record counts over here. So let's remove this record count right now and go to edit mode to discuss more about the setup section. Now the next option within setup is totals. So it displays the total of each row and column. If you have only one dimension, as we have over here only one dimension and one matrices, as you can see in pivot table. So if you have only one dimension in row or column, the option is to display a grand total. As you can see over here, we have an option to display grand total only. But if you have 2 or more dimensions, the option will include subtotal also. You will be able to show subtotal for each and every different dimensions. So if you want to show the grand total for rows, you can select this option and you will see that the grand total has appeared. Similarly, for columns, if you want to show grand total, you can select this option and your grand total will start appearing over here on the right hand side. Now, the next option within setup is sorting. So the sorting option lets you control the order of the data displayed in the pivot table. In addition, you can limit the number of rows and column displays. So for example, I have row and columns, right? If I have two columns, then I would have two different sorting options for columns over here. And if I have selected multiple dimension in rows, then I would have multiple options to sort according to the number of rows that I have selected. So for row, you can either select ascending or descending based on your requirement. So let's select over here date, and I want to show or sort my data in ascending order. Similarly, for column, you can select revenue and sort it in descending order or in ascending order. The next option that we have is default date range. So default date range helps you to select the date range for which you want to show this pivot table. So by default, Looker will select this auto. This means that it uses the default date range determined by the charts data source. So whatever date range is provided in your raw data source, this raw data source will be used for this pivot table. And if you want to custom it, then you can select on custom, and it lets you use the calendar widget to select a custom date range for the pivot table. Let me show you. If you click over here, then it shows you the calendar widget to select a custom date. So you have an n number of options over here to select the custom date. Based on your requirement, you can select any of it, and your pivot table will start reflecting data based on your selection. So for us, we'll only select auto over here so that we can show all the data. Now the next option, or you can say the last option that we have over here, is filter. So this filter restricts the data that is displayed on the pivot table by including or excluding the values which you specify. So for example, if you want to put a filter, what you can do is that you can click on add a filter, then you have to click on create a filter, then you have to put a name of the filter so that whenever in future you open this report and you are editing it, then you can just understand what filter you have applied by seeing the name. Then you have to select an option, either include or exclude that value, and then you have to select a field on which you want to apply this filter. After selecting the field, you have to select a condition from here, and then you have to give the value over here and click on save. So we are not going to apply a filter over here so that we can see all the data. So I'm going to close it. So that filter was the last option in the setup section of this pivot table. Now we'll go and click on view to see this pivot table that we have created. Now you can see that we can easily identify the relationships, right? But we can make this pivot table more visually appealing, and in order to make this pivot table more visually appealing, we have to go and understand the style properties of this pivot table. So let's go and click on edit, select this pivot and go to this style section. So this style property helps you to style the chart, and it controls the overall presentation and appearance of the chart. So the first option that we have over here is conditional formatting. It allows you to format your table based on certain condition and rules. So suppose if you want to apply any conditional formatting on your pivot table, you can click on add. Then you have two options. First option is color type. You can either select a single color or a color scale. Then the second option that we have is the format rule. You can apply a format rule either on metric, row, column, or any. Then you have to select a field. For example, if I select number of items sold, then you have to select a condition and apply or input the value over here. Once you input the value, then you can select the color and style. Okay. And then you have to just click on save, and your conditional formatting will be applied on your pivot table. So as we are using this heat map in our pivot table, so we will not be adding any conditional formatting over here. Now the next option in style is table header. So this option controls the appearance of the data label, and the first option in table header is header font color. It changes the font color of the table header. So let's keep it as black. The next option is header font size. It changes the font size of the table header. And the last option in table header is the header font family. It changes the font family of a table header. Okay. Then after table header, we have an option of table colors. These options control the color of the table border and cells. And the first option within table color is header background color. It sets the color of a table header background. So let's select yellow. Then we have an option of cell border color. It sets the color of the border between the rows. So these are the border of rows, right? So we can select it any color. So let's select red. Now the next option that we have is the highlight color. It sets the color of the highlighted bar. So based on your requirement, you can select the color of the highlighted bar. As you can see over here, whenever I go, it's gray. This highlighted or the selected row or the row on which my mouse is, it's highlighted in gray. So you can change the color from here. So let's keep it as this red. Okay. Now, if you have seen my previous video, then you might have seen that within this table color, we used to have one more option, which was odd or even row color, but we do not have over here because in our previous video, we were creating a simple pivot table. So in simple pivot table, you have an option within your table colors to set the color of odd or even rows. But as we are using heat map in this video, that's why with this heat map pivot table, Looker does not provide this option to have odd or even row color. Now the next option in style is table label. So these options control the appearance of the table data. The first option is font color. It sets the font color of your data. Then the next option that we have is the font size. It sets the font size of your data. And the last option that we have is the font family. It sets the font family of the data. Now you can see over here that we have this heat map text contrast. So it sets the font color automatically when displaying a heat map, and you can choose from 3 levels like low, medium and high. So based on your requirement, you can select the level for the contrast. Now we have an option of missing data. So this option controls how to display the missing values. For example, when data is missing from the table, you can choose to show either blank, no data, 0, null, or this hyphen. So let's keep hyphen. Then we have metric section. So for each metric that we have in our pivot table, we have all the metrics over here shown to us individually. So we have 2 matrices. First, number of items sold in 1000 and revenue in millions. So we have metric 1 and metric 2. Suppose if you have 5 matrices in your pivot table, then you will have 5 matrices shown over here to select the heat map and other properties individually. So for first metric that we have, number of items sold in 1000, by default it will always select heat map as you are using heat map pivot table. Then you can select the color, metric color over here. So let's select this color. Okay, and we will use a compact number. So this compact number, it rounds the number and displays the unit indicator. For example, suppose you have a number of 100,000 in your values over here, then what will happen is that the pivot table and Looker will show 100k instead of 100,000. So that's what this compact number does. Now the next option that we have is decimal precision. It sets the number of decimal places in matrix value. So for example, number of items sold cannot be in decimal, so we'll keep the decimal precision at 0. Similarly, for metric 2, we can give the heat map color and we can keep the compact number and decimal precision. So we can say that when we are talking about money, then we can give the decimal precision at 2. Now the next option that we have over here in style is background and border. So these option controls the appearance of the chart background container. And the first option that we have over here is background. It sets the background color. So let's select this color over here or some other color. Then after this border, we have this option of border radius. It add rounded border to the chart background. When the radius is 0, as you can see here, the radius is 0, the background shape has 90-degree corners over here. But when we select the border radius at 100, then it will produce a circular shape. So let's select 100, and as you can see, it has produced a circular shape. Moving ahead, we have an option for opacity. It sets the chart opacity. If the chart opacity is 100%, then it completely hides the object behind the chart. But if the chart opacity is 0, then it makes the chart invisible. So it's always advisable to either select 90% or 100% as the chart opacity. Moving on, we have an option of border color. It sets the chart border color. So let's select the chart border color as this blue color. Okay. Then we have this border weight. It sets the chart border line thickness. So you can select the line thickness of this border. And within this border, you have the last option for border style. It sets the chart border style, and you have 4 different styles over here. Solid, which we are using right now. Then you can use dashed. Then the third option that we have is dotted. And the last option that we have is double. So let's keep dashed over here. And if you want to add a border shadow, you can select this option, add a border shadow. So now let's go and click on this view button to see our pivot table with heat map. Okay. So as we have created this pivot table from scratch, it's very helpful to analyze our data and understand the relationship between the number of items sold and the revenue in millions, right? But before we go ahead, we need to understand there is some kind of limitations with the pivot table also. The major limitations of pivot tables are such as that pivot table can process up to 50,000 rows of data. However, depending on the data set and dimension and metric involved in the table, performance may degrade. So if you include more than 50,000 rows of data in your pivot table, then the performance will be degraded. You can apply a filter to the pivot table to reduce the amount of data being processed. The next limitation of the pivot table is that you may have up to 5 pivot tables per page in a report. Then the next limitation is that the number of row dimension available depends upon the type of data you are connecting to. So for example, for a fixed data source schema such as Google Ads and Google Analytics, you can have up to 5 row dimension. And then if you talk about a fixed data source schema such as Google Sheets or BigQuery, then you can have up to 10 row dimensions. Then the next limitation of pivot table is that you can have up to 2 column dimension and 10 matrices in a single pivot table. The last limitations of pivot table is related to its appearance, is that pivot table do not have paginate option as the standard table, so you cannot add page number or you cannot have page number on your pivot tables. And one of the major limitations of the pivot table is that you cannot apply metric filters to pivot table, and if you try to do that, then it will always display error message. So this is how basically you can create and customize pivot table with heat map in Looker or Google Data Studio. Happy learning and see you in the next video.